Cora Halloran dropped her two carpet bags on the dirt that was too hard and too dry to be called soil. The dust, the color of rust and regret, rose in a lazy cloud around the hem of her dress, a garment so worn it had forgotten its original color. Beside her, her son, Samuel, stood as still as a fence post, his small hand clutching a fold of her skirt. His eyes, wide in the gray of creek stones after rain, took in the ranch sprawled before them. It was less a picture of prosperity and more a portrait of stubborn survival. The main house sagged in the middle, as if it had sighed one day and never found the strength to inhale again. The barn leaned a little to the east, looking like a strong wind might convince it to lie down for good. Fences listed, their wires slack with indifference. This was it, the end of the line. The last name on a list her late husband, Tom, had given her. Good men, he had called them, but the first two had been buried and the third had moved to Oregon. This one, Elias Thorne, was the last flicker of a candle that had been burning down for 6 long months. Cora had walked the final 10 miles from the town of Redemption, a name so ironic it was almost a cruelty. She had $2, a packet of stale biscuits, and a 7-year-old boy who had not spoken a word since he watched his father's coffin being lowered into the ground. A man emerged from the leaning barn. He was tall and broad, but he moved with the weariness of an old draft horse that had pulled one too many plows through rocky earth. His face was a road map of sun and sorrow, his eyes squinted against the glare, or perhaps against the world in general. He stopped 20 feet away, his expression a locked door. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice was gravelly, a sound scraped raw by dust and disuse. Cora took a breath, letting it settle her. This was not a moment for pleading. Pity was a currency she did not possess and would not trade in. She had only competence, a thing as hard and real as the packed earth beneath her feet. "I'm Cora Halloran," she said, her own voice steady, a surprise even to herself. "My husband was Tom Halloran. He knew you from the cattle drives." The man Thorne did not soften. His gaze flickered to the boy, then back to her. "A lot of men knew me from the drives. Most of them are gone or broke." "We are the latter," Cora said, the admission tasting like ash. "Tom passed. The bank took the ranch." She did not elaborate on the fever, the failed crop, the slow, agonizing spiral into nothing. The facts were enough. "I am looking for work." Thorne gave a short, bitter laugh that sounded like stones grinding together. "Look around, ma'am. Does this look like a place that's hiring? I'm a breath away from selling off the last of the herd and letting the bank have the rest." "I can cook," Cora said, her voice cutting through his cynicism. "I can clean. I can mend clothes until they look new. I can keep books, proper double entry, not the chicken scratch you likely have in a drawer. I know how to treat bloat in a calf and how to stretch a sack of flour to last a month. I am not asking for charity, Mr. Thorne. I am offering a solution to problems you might not even know you have." She had said it all in a rush, a declaration of existence. She was not a helpless widow. She was a partner, now unpartnered. She was a rancher, now unlanded. The skills had not vanished with the deed to her home. They were in her hands and her head. They were all she had left. Thorne stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sounds were the wind whistling through a gap in the barn roof and the buzz of a fly. He looked at the woman, her back straight as a rod despite the frayed collar of her dress. He looked at the silent boy, a small shadow at her side. He looked at his own ranch, a place he had inherited with pride and was now managing with grim, solitary exhaustion. He had been betrayed by a partner once, a decade ago, and had trusted no one since. He hired hands for the season and sent them on their way. He did his own books, badly. He ate his own cooking, which was worse. He lived in a state of managed decay. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from a nearby corral. A shout, a curse. A pinto horse, wild-eyed, was bucking and kicking, trying to scrape a young ranch hand off its back. The boy, no older than 19, was clinging on, his face a mask of fear and determination. Another hand, older and grizzled, was yelling instructions that were being lost in the chaos. "He's gonna kill himself!" The older hand, Jed, yelled toward Thorne. "That pinto's got a devil in him!" Thorne started toward the corral, His face set in a grim line. But Cora was already moving. She did not run. She walked, her steps deliberate, her focus absolute. She placed a steadying hand on Samuel's shoulder. "Stay here," she murmured, then continued toward the fence. She watched the horse for a full 10 seconds. Her eyes narrowed. She saw not just the bucking, but the reason for it. The horse's head was twisted at an unnatural angle. Its ears were pinned back not just in anger, but in pain. "The bit," she said, her voice clear and carrying over the noise. "You're using a curb bit, but the strap is too tight. It's cutting into his jaw." The young rider, Billy, glanced at her, his eyes wide with panic. Thorne stopped, turning to look at her. Jed, the older hand, scowled. "What's a woman know about—" "He's right-handed," Cora continued, ignoring Jed completely, her eyes locked on the horse and rider. "He's pulling harder on the right rein. The horse is trying to get away from the pain. Tell him to drop the reins." Thorne looked from Cora to the horse, a flicker of something, consideration in his eyes. "Billy, drop the damn reins," he bellowed. The young man, trusting Thorne's voice over his own fear, let the leather straps fall from his hands. The pinto, freed from the agonizing pressure on its jaw, bucked twice more out of sheer momentum, and then, miraculously, stood still, its sides heaving, its body trembling. It snorted, shaking its head as if to clear it. A profound silence fell over the yard. Billy slid gratefully from the horse's back, his legs shaking. Jed stared, his mouth slightly agape. Cora walked to the fence, her gaze soft on the animal. "He's a good horse," she said quietly, "just misunderstood." Thorne walked over to stand beside her. He did not look at her, but at the horse, now allowing Billy to pat its neck. He was a man who believed in what he could see. He had seen a problem, heard a diagnosis, witnessed a solution. It was a language he understood better than words of pity or pleas for help. Clear's throat. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, met hers. The locked door of his expression was not open, but it was no longer bolted from the inside. "The cook quit 2 weeks ago," he said, the words coming out as if they were being pulled from a deep well. "Said my disposition was worse than the food. He wasn't wrong." He gestured toward a small, dilapidated shack near the main house. "You and the boy can take the old foreman's cabin. It's not much." He paused, looking her straight in the eye. "1 month," he said. "Probation. You cook, you clean, you keep to yourself. We'll see how it goes." It was not a welcome. It was a wager, a test. Cora nodded once, a small, sharp movement. "That's fair," she said. She bent down, picked up her 2 carpet bags, and without another word, walked toward the cabin that might, if she could prove her worth, become something like a home. Samuel followed, his small hand once again finding the fabric of her skirt, a silent anchor in a strange new sea. The inside of the foreman's cabin was a study in neglect. Dust lay thick as felt on every surface, and a spider had been very busy in the corner, constructing a web of architectural ambition. There was a narrow bed with a stained mattress, a small table with 1 wobbly leg, and a cold, pot-bellied stove. It smelled of stale sweat and loneliness. For another woman, it might have been the final insult. For Cora, it was a blank canvas. She set her bags down. She looked at Samuel, who was standing in the doorway, a small, uncertain figure. His silence was a weight in the room, heavier than the dust. She went to him and knelt, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "First we make it clean," she said softly. "Then we make it ours." And so, her work began. While Samuel sat on the cabin's single step, watching the foreign world of the ranch with his solemn eyes, Cora waged war on the filth. She found a bucket and a stiff brush. She hauled water from the pump, her arms protesting at first, then remembering the familiar burn. She scrubbed the floorboards until the pale grain of the wood began to show. She beat the mattress outside, sending up clouds of dust that shimmered in the late afternoon sun. She found a cracked piece of a mirror and polished it until it could offer a fragmented, wavy reflection. She did not stop. She did not rest. The work was a prayer, a meditation, a way of imposing order on a world that had become chaotic. By the time the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains, the cabin was transformed. It was still small, still bare, but it was clean. It smelled of soap and water and faint, lingering pine. Cora had found a few tin cans and filled them with the hardy purple wildflowers that grew in defiant clumps near the fence line. It was a small touch, but it was everything. It was a statement that this was not just a shelter, but a place where someone lived. Her first true test came in the ranch house kitchen. It was worse than her cabin. A greasy film covered every surface. Pots and pans were piled in the sink, caked with the remnants of a dozen miserable meals. The pantry was a disaster of spilled flour, weevilled beans, and a lingering smell of rancid bacon fat. It was a kitchen that had given up. Thorne found her there, standing in the middle of the chaos, her hands on her hips. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. Jedediah was doing the cooking, he mumbled, which explained a great deal. Cora just nodded. I'll need lye, she said, and rags, and the biggest pot you have for boiling water. She worked late into the night, long after the hands had retired to the bunkhouse, and the ranch had fallen into a deep, exhausted slumber. She scrubbed, she scoured, she organized. She was not just cleaning a kitchen, she was reclaiming territory. With every clean plate stacked, every jar wiped and labeled, she was carving out her space, establishing her domain. This kitchen was now hers. The next morning, the hands shuffled into the main house for breakfast with the low expectations born of long experience. They were used to Jed's scorched coffee and burned, greasy bacon. What greeted them instead was a scent that had been absent from the Thorne Ranch for years, the smell of hope. The coffee was rich and dark, not boiled to bitterness. There were stacks of fluffy sourdough pancakes, a bowl of scrambled eggs that were yellow and soft, not gray and rubbery, and a platter of perfectly crisp bacon. And in the center of the table sat a basket of biscuits. They were tall, golden brown, and so light they looked like they might float away. The men, Jed, the grizzled resistor, Billy, the young ally, and Silas, the quiet old sage, stopped in their tracks. They looked at the food, then at Cora, who was standing by the stove, her face impassive. Silas, a man who had worked for Thorne's father and was known to speak only when a sentence was absolutely necessary, was the first to move. He picked up a biscuit, broke it in half, and watched the steam rise. He took a bite. He chewed slowly, his expression thoughtful. Then he gave a single, decisive nod. It was the equivalent of a 21-gun salute. Billy grinned, his face lighting up. Ma'am, I ain't seen biscuits like this since I left home. Even Jed, his face a thundercloud of skepticism, could not resist. He took a pancake, slathered it with butter, and took a large bite. He chewed. He did not smile, but the hard set of his jaw relaxed by a fraction. It was a concession. Thorne came in last. He surveyed the scene, the men eating with a quiet reverence, the clean kitchen, the woman who had brought order out of chaos in less than a day. He poured himself a cup of coffee and took a sip. His eyes closed for a brief second. It was just coffee, but it was perfect. He took a plate and served himself without a word. He sat at the head of the table and ate the best breakfast he'd had in a decade. From Thorne's perspective, this was a disturbing development. He had hired a cook. He had expected sustenance, not art. The quiet efficiency of the woman was unsettling. She moved through his disordered world like a calm tide, smoothing out the rough edges, cleaning the accumulated grime. He found himself watching her. Her work was not a performance. It was an expression of her intrinsic nature. Her movements were economical, unhurried, without wasted motion. When she kneaded dough, her hands were firm and knowing. When she mended a shirt, her stitches were small and even, a line of perfect, tiny soldiers. He had given her a month. He was beginning to suspect that if she ever left, the ranch would feel her absence like a phantom limb. This thought was deeply annoying to him. Cora's days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the ranch. She was up before the first light, her footsteps quiet on the path between her cabin and the kitchen. The smell of her coffee was the ranch's new alarm clock. She baked bread, she churned butter, she tended a small vegetable garden she had carved out of a patch of neglected earth behind the kitchen. She took the cast off, the forgotten, the nearly ruined, and she made it whole again. It was the only magic she knew. Her son Samuel remained her silent shadow. He would sit on a stool in the corner of the kitchen, watching her work. He did not speak, but he began to draw. Using charcoal sticks Cora gave him from the stove, he sketched on scraps of butcher paper, the pinto horse, the leaning barn, the face of the quiet old hand, Silas. His drawings were as stark and expressive as he was silent. The hands slowly began to orbit this new center of gravity. Billy, the young rider, was the first to be captured. He had a favorite shirt, torn at the elbow. He'd been pinning it for weeks. One evening, he left it on a bench near the bunkhouse. The next morning, it was on his bunk, the elbow perfectly patched with a piece of sturdy denim, the stitches nearly invisible. He found Cora outside, hanging laundry. "Ma'am," he said, holding up the shirt. "I, thank you." Cora paused, a clothespin in her mouth. She took it out and looked at the shirt, then at him. "A man can't rope properly if he's worried about the wind catching his sleeve," she said, and went back to her work. The kindness was in the act, not the words. Billy started leaving small offerings on the porch of her cabin, a bird's nest with a single, perfect blue eggshell, a strangely shaped river stone, a handful of wild raspberries. He would talk to Samuel, not expecting a reply, telling the boy about the cattle and the clouds, pointing out the hawks circling high overhead. Silas, the old sage, showed his allegiance in his own way. He began to leave a small, neatly chopped pile of kindling by Cora's door every morning. He never mentioned it. She never mentioned it. It was a silent conversation of mutual respect. He, the master of his domain, the horses and the land, recognized her as the master of hers. Only Jed remained resistant. He was a man who measured his worth by the hardness of his life. Cora's competence, her ability to bring comfort and order, seemed to him a kind of weakness, a softening that the ranch could not afford. He saw her mended shirts and her light biscuits as a threat to the natural, masculine grit of the place. "Place is getting soft," he'd grumble in the bunkhouse. "Biscuits and patched shirts. We ain't running a damn finishing school." The confrontation, when it came, was over something small, a pot of beans. Cora had made a large pot of pinto beans for the midday meal, rich with bacon and chili. Jed took a spoonful, tasted it, and slammed his spoon down on the table. "There's onions in it," he said, his voice loud in the quiet room. "I don't eat onions. Never have." The other men stopped eating. Billy looked mortified. Silas continued to chew, his expression unchanging. Cora did not stop working the dough she was preparing for the evening's bread. "There have been onions in the beans every day for 3 weeks, Jedediah," she said without turning around. "You've eaten them every day." "Well, I can taste them today," he shot back, his face reddening. "And I don't like it. This is how it starts. First onions, then who knows what. A man has a right to a simple meal." Cora wiped her floured hands on her apron and turned slowly. She picked up a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove, its surface black and seasoned with years of use. She held it in one hand, its weight comfortable and familiar. She did not raise it. She did not brandish it. She just held it. "You have a right to the meal I cook," she said, her voice low and even, devoid of anger. "The same meal everyone else eats. The same meal Mr. Thorne eats. If you want a special meal, you are welcome to cook it yourself. The stove is hot, the pantry is stocked, but you will clean up your own mess." She looked at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. "Or," she continued, "you can eat what is served and be grateful you have food on your plate at all. There are many who do not." The air in the kitchen was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jed looked from Cora's steady face to the heavy skillet in her hand, and then to the faces of the other men. He saw no support there. Billy was looking at his plate. Silas was methodically eating his beans. And in the doorway, leaning against the frame, was Elias Thorne. He had been there for the entire exchange, his arms crossed, his face a mask. Jed's anger, faced with such calm, unassailable logic, seemed to deflate. It had nowhere to go. He was a man used to bluster and intimidation, but those tools were useless here. He had been outmaneuvered, not with force, but with reason. He looked down at his plate. He mumbled something that sounded like, "Never said I wasn't grateful," picked up his spoon and took a large, defiant bite of the beans. "With onions." The tension broke. Billy let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Thorne gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a gesture so small Cora might have missed it if she hadn't been looking for it. He had seen the challenge and the response. He had seen her handle a disgruntled hand with more authority than he himself usually bothered to muster. He had sided with her simply by his inaction, and in doing so, had cemented her authority in the eyes of the crew. The kitchen was her territory. The ranch now knew it. That evening, as Cora tidied the kitchen after the meal, Thorne lingered. He stood by the doorway, turning his hat over and over in his hands, a sure sign of a man struggling to find his words. The hands seem content, he finally managed. Full bellies and mended shirts go a long way, Cora replied, not looking up from the table she was wiping down. Jedediah can be a stubborn fool, Thorne said. Stubbornness is just conviction without reason, Cora said. He'll be fine. Thorne watched her for a moment longer. The lamplight softened the hard lines of the kitchen, catching the gold in her hair, where it had escaped its bun. He saw the faint smudges of flour on her cheek and the quiet competence in her hands. He was a man who had built walls around himself so high and so thick that he had forgotten what it was like to have someone on the inside. It was a profoundly unsettling feeling. My father built this ranch, he said suddenly, the words surprising him as much as they might have her. He thought this valley was paradise. He died trying to prove it. Cora stopped wiping the table. She turned to face him, her expression patient, waiting. I had a partner once, Thorne continued, his voice dropping, after my father passed. Name was Caldwell. We were going to expand, bring in a new breed of cattle. I trusted him. He cooked the books, sold off half my stock to a rival, and left me with a mountain of debt in a forged deed of sale. Took me 5 years to undo the damage. I swore I'd never trust another soul with the running of this place again. He looked at his hands, then at her. I do my own books now. It was both a statement of fact and an apology for the state of them. Cora listened, her stillness an invitation for him to continue. She understood what he was doing. He was giving her a piece of his story, a key to the locked rooms of his distrust. It was a gesture of trust more significant than any contract. The office is through that door, he said, nodding toward a door she had assumed was a closet. The ledgers are in the desk. They're a mess. I'll look at them tomorrow, Cora said. It was not a question. It was a promise. The next day, Cora entered the office. It was a small, cramped room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and defeat. Papers were piled on every surface, coated in a fine layer of dust. The desk was a mountain of invoices, receipts, and letters, all in a chaotic jumble. At the center of it all was a large leather-bound ledger. Cora opened it. It was, as Thorne had predicted, a mess. The entries were sporadic, the handwriting a tense scrawl. The columns for credits and debits seemed to have been used interchangeably. It was the accounting of a man who hated accounting. For 2 days, Cora did not cook. She had prepared enough food in advance to last. She sent Samuel out with Billy, who was happy to show the boy how to check fence lines. She sat at that dusty desk with the devotion of a scholar studying a sacred text. She sorted, she organized, she cross-referenced. She brought order to the financial chaos of the last 10 years of Elias Thorne's life. She started by sorting the invoices from the ranch's primary supplier in redemption, a man named Sterling Blackwood. He owned the mercantile, held the note on more than a few local farms, and carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who always won. Cora noticed a pattern. The price for a sack of feed on one invoice would be $10. A month later, it would be $12 for no discernible reason. The cost of barbed wire fluctuated wildly. There were charges for goods that seemed to vanish into thin air, never appearing in the ranch's inventory. It was subtle. $1 here, 50 cents there. But over 10 years, the stream of small overcharges had become a river. Cora worked methodically, her pencil scratching against the paper. She created a new ledger, a clean one. In neat columns, she listed the date of every invoice from Blackwood's mercantile, the items purchased, the price charged, and, in a final column, the likely correct price, based on earlier receipts or common sense. As she worked, a cold, clear anger began to build in her. This was not just business. This was theft. It was a slow, parasitic bleeding. Sterling Blackwood had been preying on Elias Thorne's distraction, his distrust, his grief. He was kicking a man who was already down. On the third evening, Thorne found her still at the desk, the light from a single lantern casting long shadows on the wall. The room was transformed. The papers were in neat stacks, labeled in her clear, precise hand. The desk was clear except for the old messy ledger and the new clean one she had created. "I was wondering where you'd gone," he said, his voice quiet. Cora looked up. Her eyes were tired but bright with a fierce intelligence. She did not speak. She simply pushed the new ledger across the desk toward him. He picked it up. He saw the neat columns, the precise figures. He flipped through the pages. Then he stopped at the final page. At the bottom, Cora had written a single number. It was the total of the overcharges, the interest she had calculated, the money that had been systematically siphoned from his ranch over a decade. It was a staggering sum. Enough to have bought a new bull, to have fixed the barn, to have hired 2 more hands for a year. Thorne sank into the room's other chair. He stared at the number, the blood draining from his face. It was the ghost of his past failure, made manifest in neat ink. Caldwell had betrayed him with a bang. Blackwood had been doing it with a whisper. "Blackwood," he said, the name a piece of grit in his mouth. "All this time." "He's the mercantile owner?" Cora asked, though she knew the answer. "He's more than that," Thorne said, his voice rough. "His land borders mine to the east. He's wanted my valley pasture for years. Says his herd needs the water from my creek." Cora looked down at the pile of papers she had yet to sort. It was a stack of old deeds, surveys, and letters belonging to Thorne's father. "What will you do?" she asked. Thorne looked at the ledger in his hands, at the evidence of his own foolishness, his own blind spot. The old Elias Thorne, the one from a week ago, would have ridden into town and confronted Blackwood, a confrontation that would have ended in fists and fury and achieved nothing. But something had shifted in him. He was no longer entirely alone. He looked at Cora. She was not just his cook. She was not just his bookkeeper. She was the person who had seen the truth he had been unwilling or unable to see for himself. "First," he said, a new hardness in his voice, a cold, calculated anger replacing the old weary kind. "We stopped buying from him. You mentioned in your notes an alternative?" Cora nodded, pulling a carefully folded page from a newspaper out of a stack. It was from a town 50 miles to the north. "Miller's Supplies," she said. "Their prices for feed are 30% lower. Even with the freight costs, we'd save money." Thorne looked at the newspaper, then back at the ledger. He saw not just the money he had lost, but the path to clawing his way back. It was a path she had cleared for him. A profound sense of gratitude, an emotion he had not felt in years, washed over him. It was quickly followed by a grim determination. "He won't like that," Thorne said. It was not a question. "Sterling Blackwood does not like to be told no." "Then he will have to learn," Cora said simply. The shift was immediate and absolute. The next time Billy went to town for supplies, he went with a longer freight wagon and a list for Miller's Supplies in the next county. He drove right past Blackwood's Mercantile without so much as a sideways glance. The message was received. 2 days later, Sterling Blackwood paid the Thorne Ranch a visit. He did not ride a dusty cow pony, but arrived in a polished black carriage drawn by 2 magnificent, high-stepping bays. He was a man who dressed in town clothes, even on a ranch, a pristine suit and a bowler hat that seemed absurd under the vast Montana sky. He was fleshy and smooth where the men of the valley were lean and weathered, his smile as false as a lead dollar. He found Thorne and Cora by the corral, where they were discussing the need for a new gate. Samuel was nearby, quietly sketching the scene. "Thorne," Blackwood said, his voice oozing a counterfeit friendliness. "Good to see you. I was worried. We haven't seen your boy in town for a while. Thought maybe there was some trouble." "No trouble, Blackwood," Thorne said, his voice flat. He did not offer a hand. "Just found a better price on feed." Blackwood's eyes, small and cunning, flickered to Cora. He had not expected her. He had heard Thorne had hired a cook, a widow. He had dismissed it as irrelevant. Now, seeing the quiet confidence of the woman standing beside Thorne, a flicker of unease crossed his face. He saw not a servant, but a partner. "Is that so?" Blackwood said, his smile tightening. "A man has to be careful. Sometimes a cheaper price means cheaper quality. You wouldn't want to risk your herd on second-rate grain." "The quality seems fine," Cora said, her voice mild. It was the first time she had spoken. Blackwood turned his full attention to her, his gaze dismissive, intended to put her in her place. "And you are?" he asked. I'm the one who checks the books, she replied. The shot was fired, silent and deadly. Blackwood's smile vanished completely. The color rose in his thick neck. He understood perfectly. This woman, this nobody, had discovered his long and profitable game. He turned back to Thorne, his voice dropping the pretense of civility. A man's business is his own, Thorne, but his debts are the town's business. I happen to hold the note on that new thresher you bought 2 years ago. The payment is due next week. I expect it to be paid in full. On time. It was a clear threat, a declaration of war. You'll have your money, Blackwood, Thorne said, his jaw tight. I'm sure I will, Blackwood said. He tipped his bowler hat in a mock salute that was a pure insult. His eyes fell on Samuel, who was watching him with wide, solemn eyes. Cute boy. Be a shame if his new home didn't work out. The veiled threat against the child hung in the air. A line had been crossed. Before Cora could react, Thorne took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. You get in your carriage, Blackwood, he said, his voice a low growl, and you get off my land. Now! Blackwood held up his hands in mock surrender, a smirk on his face. He had gotten what he came for. He had reestablished the dynamic of power, reminded Thorne of the financial chains that still bound him. He climbed back into his carriage, and with a flick of the reins, rolled away in a cloud of arrogant dust. Thorne stood watching him go, his body rigid with a fury that had no outlet. The man is a snake, he breathed. Worse, Cora said, her voice trembling with a cold rage. A snake is honest about what it is. She went to Samuel and knelt before him, putting her hands on his small shoulders. He's just a bully, Samuel. Bullies are loud because they're empty inside. Samuel looked at her, then at the retreating carriage. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of charcoal. On the dusty top rail of the corral fence, he drew a quick, savage sketch. A fat, puffy man with a tiny head and a big hat, being chased by a stick-figure horse. It was the first time Cora had seen him express anger. It was, in its own way, a victory. The payment for the thresher was a problem. It was a large lump sum payment that Thorne had planned to meet by selling off a dozen head of cattle. But Blackwood's threat changed the equation. It was clear he was looking for any excuse to foreclose, to gain leverage. That night, the mood in the ranch house was grim. The crisis was no longer a matter of numbers and a ledger. It was a clear and present danger. Thorne sat at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of cold coffee, the weight of the ranch pressing down on him. He felt trapped, the same way he had felt after Caldwell's betrayal. He was on an island, and the tide was rising. I'll have to sell the cattle, he said, his voice hollow. Even if I sell them to Miller's buyer up north, Blackwood will hear of it. He'll see it as a sign of weakness. Selling assets to cover debt is not a sustainable plan, Cora said, her voice pulling him from his dark thoughts. She was sitting across from him, the stack of old papers from his father's desk beside her. She had been sorting through them all evening. It's a temporary fix that creates a permanent problem. I don't have a choice, Thorne snapped, his frustration boiling over. There's no other money. Cora did not react to his anger. She simply pushed a faded, hand-drawn map across the table. It was brittle with age. The ink faded to a pale brown. It showed the Thorne property and the adjoining land, which was now Blackwood's. A thin blue line indicated the creek that ran between them. What is this? He asked, his voice still sharp. It's a map, Cora said patiently, drawn by your father, dated 1858. It came with the original land grant. She pointed to a section of the map where the creek flowed. Look. Thorne leaned closer. Next to the creek, his father had written something in his elegant looping script. It was a note, a detail. East Fork runs dry 2 summers in 5. Main water source is the spring in the north pasture. Thorne stared at the note. The spring in his north pasture. It was a small, unassuming thing, bubbling up from the ground. But it had never once run dry, not in the worst droughts. He had always taken it for granted. Blackwood doesn't want the creek, Cora said softly. Not really. He wants the spring. His East Fork is unreliable. Without access to a stable water source, he can't expand his herd. He's not trying to get your water. He's trying to get your land so he can have the spring. Thorne looked at the map, then at Cora. The pieces were falling into place. Blackwood's obsession with the valley pasture wasn't about grazing room. It was about water security. It was the key to his entire ambition. "It's still my spring, on my land," Thorne said, though the conviction in his voice was already wavering. "For now," Cora said. She slid another document across the table. It was not a map, but a legal-looking paper, a letter from a circuit judge dated 40 years ago. It was a ruling on a dispute between two other ranchers, miles away. "I found this folded inside the map. It's a territorial precedent. It states that in times of drought, water access can be deemed a community necessity, allowing for a legal easement to be granted, even across private property, if one party can prove their livelihood is at stake." Thorne read the letter. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. Blackwood wasn't planning to buy him out. He was planning to legislate him out. He would wait for a dry summer, claim his herd was dying of thirst, and petition a friendly judge to grant him access to Thorne's Spring. It was a long game, a patient, vicious strategy, and the first step was to get Thorne into a position of financial weakness where he couldn't afford to fight. The threat was far greater and more insidious than he had imagined. It was not a frontal assault, but a slow, creeping rot. The air left the room. Thorne felt the familiar weight of despair settle on his shoulders. He was being outplayed, outthought, by a man with more money, more influence, and fewer scruples. "He's got me," Thorne whispered. "Either way, he's got me." Cora looked at him, at the defeat in his eyes. She saw the man who had pulled himself up from one betrayal, only to be ground down by another. But she also saw the man who had given her a chance when no one else would. She saw the ranch that had given her boy a place to breathe. This was not just Thorne's fight anymore. It was hers. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a sudden, fierce conviction. "He doesn't have you. He has a plan. We just need a better one." The next week was a tense standoff. Thorne gathered the money for the thresher payment, but he did not sell the cattle. Instead, Cora's meticulous accounting had revealed another, smaller source of income they had overlooked: a contract for supplying hay to the stagecoach post, which had been underbid for years. By recalculating the rates to match the current market, they found the extra cash they needed. It was a small victory, but it was a victory. Thorne paid Blackwood on the day it was due, not a moment sooner or later. Blackwood accepted the money with a look of profound disappointment, but the larger threat remained. The legal precedent about water rights hung over them like a guillotine. A dry spell, a bad winter with little snowpack, and Blackwood could make his move. The ranch was living on borrowed time, hostage to the weather. The first snows of winter came early that year, a light dusting that outlined the stark branches of the cottonwood trees. The hands settled into the winter routine of mending tack, repairing equipment, and feeding the herd. The tension of the autumn eased into a watchful quiet. Inside the ranch house, a fragile domesticity had taken root. Cora's presence had transformed it from a mere shelter into a home. There were curtains on the windows, a braided rug on the floor in front of the fireplace, and the constant comforting smell of baking bread or simmering stew. Thorne found himself seeking out the warmth of the kitchen more and more. He would sit at the table, ostensibly to read the week-old newspaper, but really just to be in the same room as Cora and Samuel. He watched her work, the quiet efficiency of her movements a constant source of wonder. He watched Samuel, who had started to hum as he drew, a small, continuous tune that was the first sound Thorne had ever heard him make. One evening, Thorne brought in a small wooden box. He set it on the table in front of Cora. "My mother's," he said gruffly. "She was a great reader." Cora opened the box. It was filled with books, worn copies of Shakespeare, a book of poetry by a woman named Dickinson, novels by someone called Hawthorne. They were well loved, their spines soft, their pages filled with his mother's penciled notes. It was an offering of immense value, a sharing of his family's soul. "Thank you, Elias," she said, her voice soft. It was the first time she had used his given name. He liked the way it sounded. The peace was shattered by the arrival of a writer in mid-December. He was not from the area. He was a lawyer's clerk from the territorial capital, and he carried an official-looking document. It was an injunction. Blackwood had not waited for a drought. He had found a more direct route. He had petitioned the Territorial Land Office, claiming that the original survey of Thorne's property was flawed. He produced a new survey, commissioned by him and signed by a surveyor known to be in his pocket, which showed the creek and the vital spring in the north pasture as belonging to his property, not Thorne's. The injunction forbade Thorne from interfering with Sterling Blackwood's rightful access to his water resources until the matter could be settled in court in the spring. It was a brilliant, devastating move. Blackwood had leapfrogged the need for a drought or a community necessity plea. He was claiming the spring had been his all along, and by filing the injunction at the start of winter, he knew the courts and land offices would be slow, if not closed entirely, until the spring thaw. For the entire winter, Blackwood would have legal sanction to use Thorne's water. He could move his cattle onto the north pasture, and there was nothing Thorne could do about it. Thorne read the document, his face turning the color of ash. He was trapped. To defy the injunction would mean arrest. To abide by it meant letting his enemy walk onto his land and take what he wanted. He was powerless. The ranch, his father's legacy, was slipping through his fingers, and the law itself was the instrument of the theft. That evening, Thorne did not come in for supper. Cora found him in the barn, standing in the dark, staring at nothing. The fight had gone out of him. The years of solitary struggle, the betrayals, the relentless pressure from Blackwood, it had all culminated in this moment of absolute defeat. "He's won, Cora," he said, his voice a dead monotone. "There's no way to fight it. By the time this gets to court in the spring, his cattle will have grazed my north pasture to dust and drunk the spring dry. The judge will see his use of the land as a de facto claim. It's over." Cora stood in the barn doorway, the lantern she carried casting a warm circle of light in the cold darkness. She looked at this broken man, and her heart ached for him. But pity was not what he needed. He needed a partner. "No," she said, her voice firm, cutting through his despair. "It is not over. You are a cattleman, Elias. You think like a cattleman. You think of fences and land. I am a bookkeeper. I think of ink and paper. And the law is just ink on paper. It can be challenged." "With what?" he shot back. "I don't have the money to hire a fancy lawyer to fight Blackwood's fancy lawyer." "We don't need a lawyer," Cora said, her mind already working, connecting the pieces she had spent weeks absorbing. "We have something better. We have the truth." She left him there and went back to the house, to the office, to the box of his father's old papers. She was not looking for a legal argument. She was looking for a story, the story of the land, of the people who had lived on it. She spread the old maps, the letters, the brittle deeds out on the kitchen table under the light of 3 lanterns. Samuel, sensing the gravity of the moment, came and sat beside her, watching her work. She worked through the night. The hands, sensing the crisis, kept a respectful distance but did not go to bed. Billy kept the fire in the main room stoked. Silas brought her a cup of coffee. Even Jed stood by the door for a while, a silent, awkward sentry. The ranch held its breath. Cora sifted through the history of the valley. She read about the original grants, the disputes over grazing rights, the first hard winters. She was looking for a discrepancy, a loophole, a forgotten detail. She found the original survey from 1858 that matched Thorne's father's hand-drawn map. It clearly showed the spring within the boundaries of the Thorne property, but that was just one survey against another. It would be a matter for the courts to decide months from now. She needed something more, something absolute. Her eyes were burning, her back ached. The first pale light of dawn was creeping over the mountains. She was about to give up, to concede that Thorne was right, that they were beaten. Then her fingers brushed against a small leather-bound diary at the bottom of the box. It was not Thorne's father's. The handwriting was different, more feminine. It was his mother's journal. Cora almost set it aside. It felt too personal, too private. But some instinct made her open it. She read about the daily life of a ranch wife in the 1850s, the struggle, the loneliness, the small joys. She read about the birth of her son, Elias, and then she found it. An entry dated June 12, 1860. "Mr. Blackwood, our neighbor to the east, came calling today. A dour man, but not without his reasons. His youngest is sick with a fever, and their well has gone brackish. He offered to purchase our North Spring, But John Thorne's father refused. John does not believe a man should sell water. Instead, they came to an agreement, a proper one, signed and witnessed by the postmaster. We grant the Blackwood family right to draw water for their personal use from our spring, in perpetuity, in exchange for a permanent right-of-way across their lower pasture, so our herd can reach the summer grazing lands more easily. John says a good fence and a clear agreement make for a good neighbor. I pray he is right. Cora's heart stopped. She read the entry again. An agreement, signed and witnessed. It wasn't a sale. It wasn't a transfer of ownership. It was a formal, legal agreement between the two original patriarchs. An agreement that acknowledged Thorne's ownership of the spring so completely that he was able to grant access to it. It was the one thing that could cut through all the legal maneuvering, the dueling surveys, the paid-for injunctions. It was the foundational truth of the matter. But where was it? The diary said it was signed. A document that important would have been filed. Cora looked at the stacks of paper on the table. Filed. Where would a man like John Thorne file the most important document concerning his land? Not with a lawyer. He was a man who distrusted intermediaries. He would put it somewhere safe, somewhere he could see it. Her eyes scanned the room, the fireplace, the mantelpiece, and on the mantelpiece a row of old, dusty tins. One for tea, one for tobacco, one for deeds. It was labeled in John Thorne's looping script. Cora's hands trembled as she reached for the tin. It was heavy. She pried open the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a single folded document. The paper was thick, the ink dark. It was a formal agreement between John Thorne and Alistair Blackwood, Sterling's father. It laid out, in clear and unequivocal terms, the arrangement described in the diary. And at the bottom were 3 signatures: John Thorne, Alistair Blackwood, and, as witness, the postmaster of redemption, a man named Henderson. And next to the signatures was the embossed seal of the territorial notary. It was a legally binding contract, a contract that Sterling Blackwood had either forgotten or more likely had hoped was lost to time, a contract that proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that his own father had recognized the spring as belonging to the Thornes. His entire legal claim was built on a lie, and this document was the proof. Cora did not shout. She did not run to wake Elias. She sat back in her chair, the document in her hand, and allowed herself a single, deep, shuddering breath. The sun was fully up now, flooding the valley with golden light. She took the document and the diary and walked out to the barn. Thorne was still there, slumped on a hay bale, a man hollowed out by defeat. He looked up as she approached, his eyes empty. She did not speak. She simply handed him the diary, opened to the page from June 12, 1860. He read it slowly. Then she handed him the notarized agreement. He stared at the document, his father's signature, his neighbor's signature, the official seal. He traced the words with a calloused finger, as if he could not believe they were real. A slow, profound change came over his face. The emptiness was replaced by a dawning comprehension, then by a slow-burning, righteous anger. The slump went out of his shoulders. He stood up, taller than he had seemed in months. He knew, Thorne said, his voice a low rumble. Sterling knew about this. His father must have told him. He was counting on it being lost. He counted wrong, Cora said. Thorne looked at her, at the exhaustion and the triumph in her eyes. He saw the woman who had faced him down with nothing but her own integrity, the woman who had rebuilt his kitchen, his books, and now, his hope. She had not just saved his ranch, she had saved him from himself. What do we do now? He asked. The we was natural, unspoken, and absolute. We don't go to the law, Cora said. We go to the community. The law can be bought. A man's reputation cannot. That afternoon, a strange procession left the Thorne ranch. Elias Thorne sitting tall on his best horse. Beside him in the ranch's modest buckboard wagon sat Cora, holding the precious document in a tin box on her lap. Beside her sat Samuel, his sketchbook in his hands. Behind them rode Billy, Silas, and even Jed, who had, without being asked, saddled his horse and taken his place in the column. They were no longer just hired hands. They were an escort. They did not ride to the sheriff's office. They rode to the church where the town was gathering for the annual Christmas Eve service. They arrived just as the last of the families were going inside. Thorne dismounted and waited. Cora stood beside him. They did not have to wait long. Sterling Blackwood emerged from his fine carriage, helping his wife and children out. He saw Thorne and his entourage, and a look of irritation crossed his face. "Thorne," he said, his voice impatient, "this is hardly the time or place for business." "I think it's the perfect time and place," Thorne said, his voice carrying in the cold, clear air. Many of the townspeople, sensing a confrontation, had stopped on the church steps to watch. "We're here to talk about neighbors, about agreements between fathers, about honesty." He took the document from Cora and held it up. "My father and yours, Blackwood, made an agreement about my spring. We found the papers." Blackwood's face went pale. He recognized the tin box, had seen it on the Thorne mantelpiece as a boy. "That's an old, informal arrangement," he blustered. "It has no legal standing." "It has a notary seal and the postmaster's signature as a witness," Cora said, her voice clear and strong. "And it proves that your father, Alistair Blackwood, acknowledged that the spring belonged to the Thorne family. Your entire claim, your injunction, is based on a fraudulent survey and a lie." A murmur went through the crowd. These were people who lived by their word. A notarized agreement between fathers was as sacred as scripture. Blackwood looked around at the faces of his neighbors, at the hard, unforgiving eyes of the other ranchers and farmers. He saw their respect for him, which he had always mistaken for fear of him, evaporating like mist in the sun. He saw the sheriff, who had been on his way into the church, stop and watch with a keen, professional interest. He was ruined, not by a lawsuit, but by a piece of paper and a woman who knew how to read it. He stared at Thorne, his face a mask of pure hatred. Then he looked at Cora. He saw the source of his defeat. He turned without another word, herded his stunned family back into his carriage, and fled. He would not be seen in town for a very long time. Thorne stood on the church steps, the document still in his hand. He had won. They had won. He looked at Cora, standing beside him in her plain dress, her face serene in the twilight. "Let's go home," he said. They rode back to the ranch under a sky filled with stars. The mood was not triumphant, but peaceful, a deep, quiet satisfaction. When they arrived, the ranch house was glowing with light. The hands led by Billy had lit every lamp. A fire roared in the hearth. It looked for the first time like a truly welcoming place. Later, after the hands had retired to the bunkhouse, full of a celebratory meal and a measure of Thorne's best whiskey, Elias and Cora sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet. Samuel was asleep in his bed in the small cabin, which now had a proper window and a small, sturdy bookshelf Thorne had built for him. Thorne laid the notarized agreement on the table. Next to it, he laid another document, the deed to the ranch. "My father was wrong about one thing," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "He said a good fence makes a good neighbor. He should have said a good partner makes a good life." He looked at Cora, and his heart was in his eyes. "When you arrived, I offered you a month's probation. It seems to me the probation is over." He pushed the deed across the table so it rested in front of her. "This ranch, it was a place, a piece of land I was struggling to hold on to. You made it a home. It's half yours, Cora, if you'll have it, if you'll have me." It was not a proposal of marriage in the traditional sense. It was a proposal of partnership, of family, of a shared future, built on a foundation of mutual respect and hard-won trust. It was more honest and more real than any flowery sonnet. Cora looked at the deed, at the strong, capable hand that rested near it. She thought of her arrival, a desperate woman with nothing but her own competence to offer. She had come seeking shelter, a place to survive. She had found a place to belong. She did not cry. Her tears had been used up long ago. Instead, a slow smile spread across her face, a genuine smile that lit up her eyes and erased the last shadows of her grief. "I believe," she said, her voice steady and sure, "the books will need a new entry. Under assets." She placed her hand next to his on the table, their fingers brushing. It was an acceptance, a beginning. Music. Months later, a visitor riding through the valley would have seen a different ranch. The main house stood straight and proud, a new coat of paint on its walls. The barn no longer leaned, its roof line true against the sky. The fences were tight, the wires humming in the wind. It was a place of purpose and prosperity. The visitor might have seen a tall, weathered man and a capable, serene woman standing together on the porch, watching a boy who was laughing, not silent, chasing a dog across a green lawn. The visitor might have thought that Elias Thorne had finally hired enough hands to make the ranch succeed. But the hands knew the truth. The ranch hadn't needed more hands. What it got was the woman who made it a home.